All right. So today we're going to be talking about the research I did for my master's dissertation, which looked at the experience of death in the Irish and British Mesolithic. And today we're going to be going through the background all the way through a summary. Broadly, my research question asked, how were people in Mesolithic Britain and Ireland experiencing death through the handling of the corpse? And I broke that down into three more specific research questions. For today's presentation, we're going to be focusing mostly on the question A and a bit on question B. Question A is, can concepts of personhood and relationships between the human and non-human worlds be observed within the archaeological record? And B, how are these processes changing over time? And just a quick introduction to give some context. The Irish and British Mesolithic periods have different starting points. So the British Mesolithic periodization starts about 1500 years before, and then they both end in the 4th millennium BCE. It's important to note that mortuary practices of these locations and of this time have been historically viewed through the lens of what is not visible. Things like graves and burials are very rare, if any. What we are finding are disarticulated human bones, commonly found in these 5 contexts, which we'll be looking at today: caves, middens, a watery or floodplain, cremation, and open air context. This pattern was pointed out by Conler in 2011, where she makes this shift from this first way of thinking that there's really nothing there, we're just finding some scraps of bones, no one's really doing anything in the way of death practices at this time and place. And that thought was being compared to, for example, the southern Scandinavian cemeteries that are full of articulated skeletons and beautiful artifacts associated with burials. But Conler points out that maybe these random scraps of bone that we're finding that is the pattern, and they're continually being found within these 5 contexts. So just very quickly, I'll go over the aim in general. The aim of the project was to just go back and take an overall look to see what is going on, to see if we can see a story or a theme. I'll go over this aim in more detail in a moment, but the objectives were to research the archaeological evidence for directly dated human bone from Mesolithic Ireland and Britain, and create a general overview of visible patterns in each context, establish a chronology, and use HRAF to examine the ethnographic record for analogous behavior within recorded modern hunting and gathering groups. And I will, in a moment, explain what HRAF is. So queer theory was used in this project. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into as much detail as I would like and how it can be used, but I'll use Chelsea Blackmore's definition of how you can use queer theory to discuss topics beyond sex and gender. So Blackmore states that queer theory is a postmodern critique of fixity and the normalization of categories. So essentially, by applying our normalized and fixed Western viewpoints of what something is or what it should be, like dead people belonging to a cemetery, and the cemetery looks like this, and we're not finding it, so therefore it doesn't exist, for example, we create something like a mirror that reflects our current and present ideas of what things should be, and not of what is actually happening in the past. So the goal of using queer theory is to step away from those fixed ideas. And then my methods, I created a catalog of all of the sites. I placed the sites into zones, I created chronology, and I used HREF. Data collection, there are 24 sites. And within those sites, there's 36 disarticulated human bones. And I've chosen to include the bone that has only been dated to the Mesolithic. So it's without a doubt that it comes from this period and it's in the correct context. The vast majority come from these 2 Michael John et al. Papers. The 2011 paper focuses on Britain, and the 2012 paper focuses on Ireland, and that is a database of any human bone that may be associated with the Mesolithic. So all the way from the stuff that I'm looking for that without a doubt it's from the Mesolithic, to if you squint your eyes and kind of cock your head, it might be. So I pulled what I needed from those papers, and then I pulled the info from the site from Gray Lake by Burning and Firth in 2012, and Alice and Gwendolyn Cave came from Dowd et al. 2021. And then limitations, we're only looking at practices that included human bone. So a vast majority of what was happening is likely being missed. So this is only a tiny slice of what the possibilities are. And of course, there is always researcher bias. And then very quickly, just to explain what HRAF is, it stands for Electronic Human Relation Area Files. It's a database of ethnographic information kept at Yale University. And I ran 9 searches on it. The documents were all reviewed individually and cross-referenced for patterns, similarities, and points of interest against my Mesolithic data. And for example, this is one of the searches that I ran. This is what it looks like when you get your search results. You can narrow by subsistence type. I chose hunter-gatherer and sample type. And you click through here and you get all of your documents. So moving on to results. I put all of the sites into zones, and I did this for 2 reasons. The first reason was they were kind of naturally already in these little clusters, but then also I really needed to think about this geography beyond modern political borders, so this helped me kind of remove that. All the sites, all of the zones have multiple sites except for zone 6, which only has 1. And then this slide here is just kind of to establish a chronology. Over time, caves were used throughout the whole period. There is one small chunk of time where nothing was happening. We don't have any data for that, but overall it was mostly caves. And then this section right here just shows that, again, caves were used throughout the whole period. Middens were used mostly at the end of the Mesolithic. Cremations were middle to end, open air, roughly the beginning to middle, and water contacts were used somewhere around the middle. Additionally, there are 9 sites that had multiple deposits of human bone, and these are multi-generational sites. And I calculated 20 years as a generation after war in 2022. And what this means is not that someone went in and deposited multiple bones within one event. People went back for multiple events over many generations. And interestingly, the shortest space between deposits and the longest space between deposits were at the same site, Kilra Cave in Zone 9, which we now know is Ireland. And I'll go over this in more detail in just a moment. It's a very interesting place. But very quickly, I want to go over bone selection. Overall, time and place, there was an emphasis on the skull, whether that be fully intact skulls or bones of the skull, which include teeth, cranium bones, mandible, and maxilla. And then there were bones that were visibly absent, which were ribs, radii, and fibulae. And then moving on to analysis and discussion. Before I move forward, I just want to go back to the aim of the project, which was to get a general overview of what was going on. But in more detail, the aim was to explore the experience of death in the Irish and British Mesolithic by exploring social and emotional impacts of death formed by ontological perspectives, including relationships with other than human kin, including the landscape. So with that in mind, I go on to attempt to answer specific question A, which was, can concepts of personhood and relationships between human and the non-human world be observed in the archaeological record? Overall, I believe it can, based on bone selection, based on where they're being placed. But to answer that question, we have to go back and look at personhood and what makes a person, and attempting to step away from our modern concept of what a person is and what they can be, what a person can be. So to do this, I turned to Fowler's 2004 book on non-Western personhood, where he states that a person is a multifaceted being formed through relations with others. It's very important that they are formed through the relations with others, consisting of different aspects and extending throughout the material world. Mind, body, soul, image, breath are also included in the ideas of personhood. So a person can be extended beyond the human, and Fowler calls these concepts like mind, body, soul, essences, and states that with every interaction, there is an exchange of essences that builds the person. So every interaction, or every person, is a composite of their interaction with another person, be it human or other than human. And this just kind of shows that reciprocal nature right here. And continuing with this question, we'll be talking about negotiating death and context. So whether it's in a midden, whether it's in a cave, that's what I mean by context. A role within a community or manner of death may dictate which death processes a person may go through and where they'll go. There are multiple examples of this when I searched through HRAF. An example of this is an ethnography of the Aleut of Alaska by Drucker in 1951, which states that low-ranking chiefs and commoners were placed in high trees or in caves, and also that slaves were cremated. Interestingly, he also states that these practices changed over time, stating that anciently there was no difference in how people, there was no difference in the method of disposing of a corpse. So not only did this process change over time, but your role within society and what you did determined the manner of which your body was processed and where your body would go. And because we're speaking of disarticulated human remains, we have to talk about manipulation and fragmentation of the body. So purposeful manipulation and fragmentation of the body can happen in multiple ways and says a lot about a culture's worldview. It's important to remember that death is transitional for both society and the deceased. The practice of fragmentation may assist in transitioning or reintegrating the dead into a different order of persons or a different entity. So taking a living person, taking them from a living person to a non-living person, and also taking the society from a society with this person to one without that person. And for an example of how this can reflect a worldview, I'll use excarnation, which is leaving the body to the elements. For disarticulation, leaving it to the wind, the animals, vegetation. And that can be described as reflecting the reciprocal nature between humans and other than human kin. So nature has given up its physical form in the way of food, in the way of presenting materials to humans for support, and then humans give up their physical form to support nature. And then very quickly, I would like to describe the definition of a persistent place. So persistent places are places that are returned to over a long period of time for certain activities. These sites may signal to current users what the site should be used for by materials left behind by previous users who were active for many years before. And this is after Warren 2022. So we move on to question B about how these processes change over time. So no single zone was consistently used over time, although there are chunks of times where different zones were more active. For example, zones 4, 5, and 6, that we know now as Wales, was active from the very beginning, but then begins to phase out around the middle. And then zone 7 only becomes active at the very end of the period. Again, I'd like to emphasize that I'm only talking about practices that include human bone that has been deposited, that was able to be preserved, and then was able to be dated. So we're looking at a very narrow section of things. And just because the people in zone 7, we only see them at the end of the period, doesn't mean that they weren't active and didn't have great mortuary practices. It just means that we can't see it right now in the archaeological record. And then coming back to the 9 sites that had multiple bone deposits, these were likely persistent places. Again, these were calculated through generations, with 20 years being a generation. And in my dissertation, I took 2 sites as case studies, Agaf Yer Yekin, and I apologize for my pronunciation, in zone 5 from Wales, and Kilra Cave in zone 9 from Ireland. Both of these were used for over 1,000 years, with Kilra Cave being almost 2,500 years. And what's interesting to note about these is they were used at the same time as other nearby sites that were also used for mortuary practices. So people were choosing to come back to these over the years continually, and they stayed in the public memory. And here's an image I made of the timeline of when these bones were deposited. As you can see in zone 5, it's more concentrated right here, but in zone 9, we have 2 spikes of use. This is the shortest period, 30 to 50 years, which is 1 to 2 generations. And this is the longest period right here. I think it's 110 to 112 generations in between. With such a large gap in use, it must have remained as significant to people who went there. Whether it was a striking feature in the landscape, there was myths about the cave, or just had the remains of generations gone by, it remained an important place. And it's also important to note that this significance and why it was important likely would have changed throughout time. It wouldn't have stayed the same, but it did stay important to the people that lived nearby. And then to summarize, to end, to wrap it all up, I want to go back to the aim, was just to see an overall view of what was going on during this time period, because there wasn't a lot of information. We started with, there were scraps of bone, not a lot is visible. There's no cemeteries, so there probably wasn't a lot going on. But by looking at a different worldview and thinking about what a person is, you'll see that there is no need for a cemetery because there's different understandings of personhood and of the body. Negotiating where someone goes in the process in which their body will be disposed was very complex. And the bones that were chosen carefully and with much consideration, because there's bones that are included and there's bones that are not included. And I will go ahead and stop there. I want to thank you all so much for your time,